Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Firewall, the business bytecast, where tech meets business. Get expert insights from real-world business leaders, IT experts, and the latest trends in bite-sized episodes. Stay ahead and explore what's beyond the firewall. Hello, and welcome back to Beyond the Firewall, where we bring business and technology together. Today, we're really proud to bring in Steve from Acronis. Welcome, Steve. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for having me here today. Steve Brining, Cybersecurity Evangelist at Acronis. Been with the company about 8.5 years. Cybersecurity space for about 30 years, mostly on the manufacturing side, but I also, I'm here in the US, but I also am a commanding officer in the Arizona Army National Guard, and I'm going to be retiring from that in July this year. So it's going to move me on to different pastures once I'm done with that, and also a part of FBI's InfraGuard.
Thank you for your service.
I appreciate that. Thanks. I get to grow my hair long and I'll try to have more of a goatee.
You don't like my military cut? I don't know if I qualify there, So yeah, I've always enjoyed the shortcut myself, except for my high school days. That's when I grew it out. But after that, it just doesn't go for your daily style.
I don't know if this is going to grow long. It's probably be unmanageable for me.
So Acronis has been around for a long time. I think everybody's used to that company's name around, backup and disaster recovery. In the last little while, there's been a little bit of talk around, Acronis kind of moving into the cybersecurity space. But, one of the terms that is really becoming a big theme or a big buzzword in the industry right now is cyber resilience. And I'd love to sort of get an understanding of what does that mean to you?
Yeah, when it comes to Acronis, we've kind of changed our whole theme, if you will, more about protect, manage, and automation. So with that comes the security piece, right? So yeah, I'm asked this question a lot. And I would say that cyber resilience is beyond just backup and recovery, right? It means can your business withstand an attack and maintain the operations? Not just restore data days later, right? So traditional cybersecurity, we all think about, right? Oh, that's very prevention focused, right? Firewalls, EDR, blocking threats, right? But when all that prevention stuff fails, and it will, resilience is what keeps the revenue flowing. So you got to integrate a lot of that security into your business recovery workflows. We all talk about AI today. How do you trigger automatic isolation? And how do you have clean backups, right? To spin up replace systems, right? So to me, the business difference is downtime measured in minutes versus days. Right? Your clients, right, that you have, they're not gonna care about the detection, right? They care about, say, their point of sale system, staying online during an attack, right? So resilience is the revenue protection layer, I call it, that actually turns security of what you do and your end users from a cost center to what I'll call a business continuity guarantee.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how we evolved that sort of resilience, where companies would be like, okay, can I recover my data? Will I be back up and running within 24, 48 hours? And now it's minutes. And that conversation now is, well, isn't that what we subscribe to? Isn't the backup service I signed up 5 years ago going to give me that 5-minute response time and getting things back up? And I find that there's a major disconnect on what people are subscribing to and what their expectations in their mind is like. Okay, well, I'm in the cloud, I should be able to click this button and be back up and running in 5 seconds. But no, that doesn't always work that way. So
Yeah, I think
it's interesting.
the businesses really need to have a really good understanding of service level agreements
Yes.
internally and get buy-in from management. But service level agreements really don't sometimes apply to when the stuff hits the fan. So you can have these typical service level agreements, but sometimes, depending on the type of attack, they're not going to. There has to be an expectation that sometimes these SLAs are going to fall out of scope. And those are hard business conversations to have, but the executives really have to have buy-in and understanding of that also, and take accountability for that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So talking about these breaches and everything, what are you and what's Acronis seeing as sort of the top three attack vectors that are hitting the market right now.
Yeah, we have a true team, a threat research unit team, and I'm always asked this question, right? So like I every week I reach out to them and say, "Hey, has anything changed?" But I would say the first would be AI powered attacks and malware and phishing. AI, AI by itself didn't like enable new attacks, this last year, right? What it did was it for lack of a better term would say industrialize them. A company out there, know before. I know they had some phishing threat report and they said that, God, it was like over 80% of phishing emails now have some kind of AI generated elements to it. So what's really changed is is the speed and scale. They now deploy what I call auto adaptive phishing campaigns, where these AI agents will analyze, say, people's failed login attempts, right? And then they'll dynamically rewrite lures to real time some of the bypass filters, right? And then voice cloning has really gone mainstream. Phishing attacks. I'm actually personally working on me being live on a screen while I'm also standing there on stage and people are going to ask me questions. I'm kind of working on that one for a deep fake type thing. But phishing attacks, voicemail attack type things using deep fake audio is definitely happening out there too. Second is the what they say, ransomware evolution, if you will, right? So in 2026, ransomware is not about just encrypting anymore, right? It's about leverage, right? It used to be double extortion, right? Steal and encrypt, right? Now there's triple extortion where they add like DDoS pressure, right? Or contacting your customers directly. Companies like, ransomware gangs like Lockbit 3.0 and Black Bass are famous for that. But what people don't realize is that there's these ransomware as a service groups. When I was going through grad school for my master's in cybersecurity about 5 years ago, I had belonged to one for 30 days. Yeah, I'm not a Python coder, but I got a piece of malware, and then they tried to upsell me to give me an upsell to, would you like to do a DDoS attack? And they priced it per bot, and they had volumes on that. It was pretty wild. So one of the things I'm seeing though is these ransomware as a service gangs are trying to infiltrate insider access. To me, that's a big thing. They're trying to recruit workers, right, and even third party vendors now with legitimate system access to things to bypass the defenses of the perimeter out there. Let's see. I would say the third would be supply chain attacks. How do I say this? Singularity. There was this campaign, August to November last year, and it was a coordinated worm or write once, read many type attack that moved laterally through the dependency chain. And so when they compromised the server, the malware actually propagated through every one of those organizations consuming that package, right? It was a self-replicating attack surface. What terrifies me about supply chain attacks is you can have the perfect security hygiene out there, but you still get owned because some vendor's intern clicked some stupid link.
Right.
So yeah, those
Yeah.
would be the three for me.
Yeah, and then it's interesting, like the stats are coming in that, 95, almost 100% of all breaches today, majority, let's put it this way, high number, is still end user error, right? Where they've been lured into clicking on a link, lured into, revealing some level of information. And then at the end of the day, from what I'm still seeing out there is companies are not putting any emphasis on or enough emphasis on cyber awareness training. They figured the spam filter is going to do the best job possible. And, the evolution of that's still not going to cut it. And then the other really, really new thing that I'm seeing is that voice, cloning. And I've actually seen SIM cloning now too, because you can eSIM anything, right? Like almost all phones today don't come with a SIM card. So there are services out there that you can put your phone number in. It'll tell the hacker your carrier and most likely your eSIM number. You can now put that detail into any other phone out there. And then if you're looking at basic two-factor authentication, they can get those, one-time authentication codes instantly. The second part is now when companies are looking at voice verification, there are unfortunately too many of these amazing services like HeyGen or other voice, cloning software where I can upload 30 seconds of this voice. And now somebody's on a keyboard waiting for the question of like, okay, so where are you born? And just, type it in and it says it back. Yes, there's a 1 second or 2 second delay, but for security purposes, most systems are not designed to pick up that gap or that response, and the voice is coming in that person's voice. So we're no longer going to be able to verify by voice just by answering simple three questions like, what city were you born in, and what's your phone number, or what's whatever secret word, or whatever, like the usual questions that we've been seeing. And everybody's like, well, where do they get my voice? I'm like, your stuff's usually on Facebook or some other social media that somebody recorded you and posted it, and your stuff's way out there. So you
Well, what
don't need
about
5 minutes.
when you think about it, what about when you, and I do this in my presentations live, I tell people without showing a raise of hands, who has a voicemail like this on their phone? Hi, thanks for calling. I'm sorry I can't take your phone call right now, but if you'd like, leave a break. Really, you leave all of that, and I can record that, and now I actually have all of what you just done, right? And you're
Yeah.
allowing me that. Now, these security questions that you're talking about, like where was I born? I put bogus information in that only I know, right? Like, what's your favorite color? And I'll say chicken. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't answer them truthfully, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and then my password manager, yeah, I know what those security questions, the answers are, you know, so I changed the security questions.
So you were born on Pluto, and your favorite
Yes,
color is chicken, and your favorite color is, a
you
car
know,
or something like that.
my sister's middle name is, well, we'll leave that one alone.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, it's nuts that we have to be cryptic now on our cryptic passwords, and you have to remember that because now
Oh,
you
and by the
can't
way,
use the same one.
my favorite color is not chicken. So anyone listening to this, don't try chicken on me. That's none of them.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We'll make it spaghetti for next time. So,
Correct.
that's cool. And so we're going through an evolution, and you kind of touched on the AI attacks, and kind of what's evolving in that sector. But what have you seen otherwise, outside of the AI bots? What other types of things are you seeing right now that are making businesses more vulnerable than ever? Because I feel that we're starting to see a big new surge of vulnerability kicking up.
Yeah. Again, AI driven attacks, ransomware. You said, humans making
Yeah.
issues, right? And it's really a convergence of all three of those, right? That whole ransomware as a service has democratized, if you will, and really been the accelerant out there. And they're very hyper personalized now with those types of things. So SMBs face enterprise grade like tactics without having the budgets. I mean, human error really hasn't really increased, but the attackers themselves now engineer it very with AI crafted engineering. So really, you can't train your way out of this. These defenses require definitely architectural controls. Like you got to have immutable backups, zero trust access. And always assume credentials will be compromised in your business thought for that. So that's kind of where I see where things have changed, recently. Hopefully I'm answering that question correctly.
Yeah, you are. And definitely reinforcing those challenges are definitely, forefront, I think, to most listeners out there. They're looking at going, okay, well, AI is obviously part of the hack force now. And my end users are part of the weakest link. I'm also seeing a bit, and this I'd like to see what's your perspective on this. 5-10 years ago, EDR was the new thing. And in the last 3 years, there was MDR. Like everybody was like MDR. And now there's XDR, or XDR and MDR are kind of competing in that buzzword space, and what I'm seeing out there for companies that we're advising, reviewing, or even providing services for is the confusion between XDR, MDR, EDR, and some of the other things like ZTNA and all these other vectors that have evolved and emerged in the last 24 months. not even, I think I would say the last 12 months, some of the solution architecture that they have in their business space goes back 24 months, which is now almost obsolete. I'd love to sort of understand a little bit. Maybe you can help me or help distill this out for some of the people out there. What are the differences between an MDR, XDR, and sort of like, are we looking at a different, sort of vector around how to tackle this? Or are the 1, 2 year old solution stacks going to be able to still mitigate some of that risk?
I would have to say that, and the thing is that the more that we have these buzzwords out there, the more confused people start to get sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. So the only thing that I always say to people is prevention and detection cover different parts of the threat landscape. Again, you can have all the prevention layers in the world set up, and yet you'll still be bypassed, right? Now, EDR can alert you to something that say, hey, we didn't mitigate it, and you're alerted, but you got to do something, right? Well, now with vendors like us, like we're going to have workflows that say, hey, automatically isolate the workload. That's great. But now you got to look at the whole contextual behind that. And that's where like EDR, that's why they extended it into XDR, right? Because now you have to understand, okay, where did this threat vector actually occur from, right? What were the indicators of compromise? How did they get in, right? And you have to look at all that stuff because one of the things I've been telling people is for 2026, you really got to get your identity and access management down. But you have to understand, like, okay, now I need to look at, say, Azure and Entra ID, and look at how is that being compromised? Did we have someone that left 2 years ago that's still in the system? Uh, um, that still has access. What are we doing with remote access, right? So there's all these different vectors, and that's why they call it XDR, right? It's like anything detection and response now, right? But the key part is to make sure that things get very integrated very well. I mean, we have over 300 plus integrations with a lot of things, but you need those integrations to make sure that no matter what people are running, you still have to have context to say, I need some more visibility into this and what happened. And really, what MDR really does is say, hey, at 2 in the morning, you don't have a staff. We're there to help cover it. Right. Now, true, a lot of systems now are like automatically isolating the network at 2 in the morning. I'll call that tier one MDR. But just because you can roll back doesn't necessarily mean where is it? Are they still in there? Is there a back door still? Right. Just because you got back up and running because you isolated, say, that server and you recovered it just prior to the impact. Okay, great. Yay, congratulations. But you don't know where they're still lingering. I mean, Equifax, they were in there for what, 76 days before everything got hit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they had a lot of things wrong with them. But that to me was like, that was classic 101 of like how not to do anything right system with that. Yeah. So I hope that answers that question. I kind of
Yeah.
went
Yeah.
off on my tangent.
No, no. Actually, I love these cases because at the end of the day, we look at it, Equifax is a big corporation, and small business or mid-sized businesses are, struggling to figure out how much is enough. At the end of the day, one of the things I struggle with a lot of companies out there is you can go nuts, right? Like you could literally be spending north of $100 a month per employee between MDR, XDRs, ZTNA, cyber awareness training, cyber warranty. The number of options out there are endless in respect to adding layers upon layers of security. And that still does not prevent you from being breached, right? It's your defense mechanism.
Yeah, and that's why I think, for talking to companies here, they got to really talk about governance, right, and oversight for this stuff because you're not going to have enough budget to do everything, and even if you do, you're still going to get hit, and that's where that cyber resilience piece comes in, right? And then you're not going to have enough time to work on disaster recovery plans and tabletop exercise. I mean, you're just not going to have enough time, so they have to then say, okay, where's my data? What's the value of each data? How do I define the criticality of that data? And based on all of that, what's my business impact analysis? And then I have to start saying, okay, what controls do I put in to cover at least 80%? And are we okay with the risk tolerance or the risk appetite, if you will, of the stuff that's left? Well, who signs off on that? It's got to be people that could be accountable because accountability you can't delegate, right? So that has to be the executive teams. And that's where governance comes in. It's like, do we buy off on the risk that's left, that residual risk, as we say, right?
Mm,
And to me, it's about prioritization. And to me, it's like, look, you can have 5 servers, right? But one of them has, well, in the military definition, right? Controlled unclassified information versus top secret. I think I'm going to focus a little bit more on the top secret stuff first, right? And prioritize where my expenditures are because there's more value to that data. Right. So, I mean, yeah, MFA. Yeah, and then you have to think about regulations and compliances, right? Quebec, Law 25, right? And cyber insurance out there, right? They're going to put requirements in there. So you got to add both, contractual, regulatory, cyber insurance on top of what you think your risk appetite is also. Right. So it's just a matter of figuring out where all of that lays and then from a business perspective to say, okay, we got this much budget. We figured out this business impact analysis. We classified everything. Are we okay with the risk that's left over?
okay, and that makes complete sense. Distill this back because like you used the word right now, or you a minute ago, governance,
Hmm.
right? Step back, distill this to the audience in the sense of like, what do you mean by that? Because if I got a law firm or a manufacturing company, and even if it's 100 employees or 50 employees, like talk to me. What does that distill? You talked about the executives being accountable. Distill that conversation down from like, let's call it like a layman's term, because I think a lot of companies out there have yet to hear this term, and I think it would be good to understand it.
Yeah, it's in the NIST cybersecurity framework that's out there. They used to have 5 pillars, right? They added a 6th called governance, right? So everyone's got like, there's so many different elements out there. But for me, governance to me is a framework of authority, accountability, and a very well defined decision making structure that makes sure that the company's activities that are being done align with whatever the strategic objectives of the company are, followed by the regulatory obligations, but also all the expectations of stakeholders, right? While still enabling oversight, if you will, risk management and delivering value to it, right? So, in other words, governance is, are we doing the right things, right? Strategic alignment, accountability, right? Management is like, are we doing things right? Efficiency, implementation, and then compliance is, are we following the required rules, right?
Mm,
So, board of directors and executives really have to set the company strategy and the risk appetite, if you will. And that's what governance is to
very cool. I appreciate that clarity because I think with when it comes to
me.
compliance, and that's another kind of transition to this question.
Well,
You know,
I was just thinking, we said Quebec's Law 25, and I'm just thinking right
yeah,
now, I do believe that they actually have in there, they demand board accountability for data protection failures. So they have to start thinking about governance because in Quebec, Law 25 is kind of like saying it to them. It's like, oh, you don't have governance? Oops. So I think in
yeah, and I
Quebec,
heard
that's a big
I
one.
heard Quebec is putting some serious teeth into it for accountability. That if they're not going to do something about it, they will do action. Whereas in Canada in general, I feel we're not as kind of serious about it as some other countries where like Europe has got more stringent rules around it. And even in the US, I find that more and more organizations are following NIST or in Europe
Or the NIST
GDPR.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like, and this is again a series of terms that are not familiar to the general masses. I think that big corporations are used to hearing these phrases. Why don't we kind of touch on that in the sense of these compliance regulations, ISO 27001, NIST? Give everybody like a very high level conversation about why and why we should be striving for that, even the most basic framework.
Yeah. So the reason why all these frameworks exist is to give a company an idea to say, we don't know what to do. Well, at least they give you something. If it's regulatory and you fall into it, like for example, like here in the US, for example, an example I use is like, HIPAA, you know, well, backup and disaster recovery is kind of a requirement. So if you're not doing disaster recovery and you're in HIPAA, don't you see that you're not following? And if something happens, they're going to come back to you. And if you get stuck in an audit, you better be following something, right? Because they're going to say, Well, what are you following? Well, we're following nothing. That's not a good answer. But the reason why they're putting these out there is because it's setting the, and again, I'm trying to overgeneralize, but the reason why they're doing it is just about, well, in Europe, it's about protecting, the end user's data and giving them options and stuff. But they're like, for example, all the laws like with like PIPEDA and Quebec Law 25 and all that. They're really just trying to say you're going to be starting to be responsible. So in order to be responsible, here's some frameworks that you need to look at. And at least if you're following a framework, at least we're going to be easier on you. But if you're not following a framework or guidance, yeah, we're going to come down harder on you and we're going to use you as an example. That's the way I look
Right.
at
No, that makes complete sense. And part of that as a next step for most businesses out there, is one better than the other, or
it.
any of them is going to be in line with, keeping you somewhat within the guardrails?
Well, I mean, if you're in Quebec, I mean, you better be looking at Law 25 because it applies to Quebec. If you're in the financial world, right, you better be looking at GLBA, right? So it depends. You got to look at least the ones that impact the industry that you're in first and
Right.
foremost, right? But then there's frameworks, like for example, like the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's optional, right? For people, right? But they can use it to help them define, like their target profile of what they want, choose the controls and things like that. But at least it gives them something that was a best practice standard for them out there to start with. But I would be like, look at, if you got cyber insurance, you better start there. Look at compliance and regulatory stuff related to the industry that you're in. You better start there and get those things underneath. Those are non-negotiable in my opinion, because if something happens and you don't follow those, wow, you're really in a world of hurt. Those I would start with, then pick something else to start looking at your framework. Depending on the type of business you're in. If you're in manufacturing, probably the ISO stuff, right? So it depends on what industry you're in. Like for example, the military and the federal government. Yeah, we have the NIST risk management framework. That is not. We can't use something else, right? We have to use that as an example because that's
Right.
what's required about. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And for listeners out there, like we've worked with all the different most of them, not all. We've worked with a lot of the North American ones, and what I found, especially when you look at it from a checklist perspective, there's a lot of overlap. There are nuances between the different frameworks, between NIST, ISO, and a few others that we've worked on. Um, there's fundamentals that are identical, and then there's nuances between the different frameworks that have their own unique twist. So, building around one platform, gives you a good direction, that even if you have to pivot from ISO to NIST or NIST to ISO, or, or any of the other platforms, the bulk of the work has already been done.
I was
It's
going to
just
say
a
there's a lot
matter
of
now.
overlap.
Yeah. And so it makes it easier to transition, or at least say, hey, I got this framework done. Let's find the differences in this other framework, so that it's not really a forklift. It's not saying we invested all this money and it's gone down the drain. We actually can just move the needle over.
Well,
So I
I
think
was going
picking
to,
one.
yeah, compliance and security, right? You think about like compliance frameworks will like measure documentation, not necessarily resistance, right? I mean,
Yeah.
a company can pass, like, say, a SOC 2 audit, right? With perfect policies, right?
Hmm.
But they could be running unpatched systems, right? Because the auditor never tested exploitability.
Right.
Well, let's face it, these attackers don't care about audit reports. They probe for like the technical gaps that are out there, right? So if a company says, yeah, we invest 80% of our security budget on compliance evidence, but they got all these critical gaps left over. So a small business does multi-factor authentication for email, compliance checkbox,
Hmm.
but they leave RDP ports open on the internet without MFA. So to me, compliance is a floor, not a ceiling.
Yeah.
And then I think anyone that's in security needs to look at it like they got to run parallel with this, right? One for audit evidence, but another one for continuous threat validation.
Interesting. So kind of pivoting that. So now companies are going to be, focusing on that, looking at their compliance and getting some frameworks built out. You know, let's take a start taking a look at some action items. I think that, you know, Acronis is seeing, what you're seeing in the industry, what sort of action items, or what would you say is the next step today, 2026? We've got AI, we've got all these other challenges going on. What would be the first move, or what are the first steps you would recommend to any company revisiting their cybersecurity resilience?
Hmm.
Loaded question, I know.
Yeah, I would say identity and access controls, specifically privilege management, privilege account management, right? That's a big thing for me. I would definitely look at those kind of things, right? So, like, audits will check if MFA exists, right? But they don't see if there's like break glass accounts to bypass it. Do service accounts have access permissions, or uh, or an employee has recently departed without their cloud access being fully revoked and stuff like that. So I would say at least 50% of what I've seen starts with compromised credentials, where MFA was, well, it's technically in place, but it's circumvented by something, right? Especially with like fatigue attacks on MFA, right? And also backup integrity. People always talk about this 3-2-1 rule, right? 3 copies of your data, 2 different mediums, one stored off site. I've been saying an extra one and then a zero on top of that, where that extra one is it's got to be immutable, and then the other one, and the zero basically means zero errors in the backup. Because even though it might be clean, if you can't restore it, it's not worth it. So yeah, that would be an area that I would look at. And you're saying prioritization really comes down to is like, look, if in cyber insurance is asking for security awareness training, once a quarter, well, you better get security awareness training under wraps with that, right? If they're saying you must have MFA across everything, great. Many are requiring EDR today, right? So if you don't have EDR and you have a cyber insurance policy and they require it, well, I mean, you're saying, where do I prioritize it? Well, look at what is required of you first and foremost. To me, that would be the thing. And then there's so many companies that just do these incident responses like it's like pulling teeth, or like, I'm going to hang myself with a noose, and it's just like they don't understand that. And I've been through this where when the stuff hits the fan, it is amazing how people will be during an incident when the stuff's really hitting the fan, and people will change. And as leaders, you got to be calm. You got to show that calmness throughout the whole thing, while other people, and I will just indirectly say supposedly, somebody gets mad and they threw a keyboard up against the wall and all the keys fell out. That's why you got to go through these exercises. And if things change, you acquire a business, processes just changed, right? And you need to get back. And I think look at what your insurance requirements are, look at what your compliances and regulations require. Those are first and foremost. Then I would definitely be saying you better have immutable backups, right? And incident response readiness on top of that.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, and I agree with you on that. The one thing I would add to that, and this is sort of my recent kind of realization, is a lot of companies invested in, I call it disaster planning when the pandemic hit. So a lot of companies realized, wait a minute, we can't go back to the office. We're gonna set things up so that we can work anywhere, anytime. And it was sort of a aha moment to revisit things. And I feel that a lot of companies have been sitting on that playbook since then. And it's not 1, 2 years ago. We're talking now, we're pushing 5 years ago that this happened. And, you know, have you revisit this? Have you even looked at your strategy, and have you even tested this strategy, and have you updated your plan, right? Because it's one thing to have a disaster plan. It's another thing, like you said, to test it and verify it, and being able to. And a lot of small businesses, I don't even think, do a annual recovery test. They'll do a fragment test where they'll restore a file or a document, but have they tested that? So I think it's time a lot of companies revisit this whole emergency plan. And the tools have changed, the playbook has changed, and as part of what you're saying before, I think you need to kind of look at your insurance, because even your insurance from 3 years ago has evolved. Their requirements have completely changed. And when you're starting to marry that legacy playbook for your disaster plan, your insurance company's current requirements, a lot of people are just auto filling their paperwork and then not realizing they're not going to be covered for the insurance when they need to make a claim because they didn't actually fill it out correctly.
Well, at times of renewal, they'll change the terms and conditions on these things, and CFO will just like renew it. But they never talk to the security team to say, "Oh, by the way, this changed. Can we do this?"
Yeah.
they just renew it, and they don't even read the terms and conditions. I was curious, so I actually looked at a policy, and I kid you not, this is what it said: all systems must be patched within 7 days. Does that mean a low versus a critical patch, right?
Yeah.
All systems must be patched. To me, that meant every patch that exists for it must be patched and every system within 7 days. That is so unrealistic,
Yeah.
right? And you're like, yeah, but it's written by lawyers for lawyers. They change the terms and conditions on it to say, oh, we need an out in case they screw up because we don't want to
Yes.
pay. That's their job, right? They want to collect the money. They got some actuaries saying, no, we do this, and they'll make sure of it. But you have to read those terms and conditions because they will change in your policies.
Yes. We've seen it over and over again because we fill out half the applications for our clients today,
Mm.
and we realize that they keep on adding new little loopholes or new changes or nuances that sound the same, but they're not the same as
Have you?
previous years.
I'm just curious because you're helping them fill out the applications, but have you seen some insurance companies actually give you software to run in order to get the information? Because some of them are saying, "Hey,
There,
you need to run this on your systems and give us the report in order for us to help rate the policy." I've been kind of seeing that on some.
we've seen that. We've also had insurance companies come back and say they've done a scan through their providers without even us installing anything. They've done a scan somehow, I guess through an email address or through some open public ports, and they're trying to hack into their clients' environments. And
Or they
they've
could have
come
been
back
using
and
Nmap or something like that, right? To
yeah, and they're saying we found the following pile of stuff on your network and publicly available, and we're concerned about all these risks.
yeah, it's
It's pretty impressive what they can do, and they're not telling you about it. The assumption, you know.
exactly.
So, it's an interesting one there. So, yeah, it's an interesting world that we're living in right now. I think that we've seen a lot of things change in the last 4 or 5 years. I think that one of the challenges I'm still seeing with a lot of companies right now is the hybrid work. It's still a big conversation, remote work, and there are a slew of challenges with that, even globalization. Most companies today have globalized their workforce in some capacity. Well, what's your take on some of the challenges there, and you know what can you recommend companies to do to help mitigate some of the risks involved with remote works, both locally and globally these days? Because I think there's a series of new things that are happening now with, call it, one of the banks here in Canada, they accidentally hired people from North Korea that were supposed to be in Canada. And then the only reason why they found out was they were trying to install malware through their network. And it was North Korea employees. So like, what's your take on that?
Well, just like the zero trust architecture out there, never trust, always verify. You're putting these HR systems right through these AI applications, just assuming everything starts to happen. It's like I always tell people, especially with business email compromise, it's like do the old sneaker net. If it just seems a little weird, like, oh, at the end of the day, sense of urgency, pay this invoice. It's like, I don't know, you got that in an email. Hey, how about picking up the phone and calling or sending it through a different method, like through your teams or walking down the hallway, right? To do things, right? It's like almost back to basics, right? But remote work, I mean, let's just face it, it's remote hybrid. I mean, it's permanent. You're never going to get 100% back, right? And then
Mhm.
even if you do, people will be resistant to that because they're so conditioned now with these things, right? But you got misconfigured home networks, right? With people, right? Password reuse, right? Across, say, their personal and work accounts. To me, they reuse passwords, right? So you want to enforce that phishing resistant MFA type stuff, right? And I always tell people if you have a choice between using SMS and authenticator app, please use an authenticator app, right? Think about deploying conditional access policies, right? Maybe block some logins for some like Tor networks or something, right? In your in if people are using SaaS based, right? Because they're remote, right? Overprivileged accounts, right? So maybe quarterly, look at this is the identity and access management thing, right? Maybe quarterly do some access recertification. Oh, there's tools out there that will automate this for you out there. Um, and then there's just in time access for like admin consoles and stuff like that, right? Identity and access management. Definitely think about BYOD devices, right? Because now you're really getting into this remote work and these people are traveling and so forth, right? Separate the corporate from the personal stuff on there. Again, people having Wi-Fi vulnerabilities at home. Admin, they never changed it, right? Sometimes companies, they'll give you a travel router with pre-configured security in it, right?
Yes.
Think about any kind of legacy VPN stuff, right? Zero trust network access, right? Do that, right? So VPNs by themselves, right? They'll do a trusted network. That's great. But zero trust, right, is granting application level access. So no lateral movement if you're compromised there. And then the patching, that's a big one too, right? People patch during business hours. Right? Sometimes that can hurt people from that perspective. So I would say the implementation path when it comes to remote work, if I had to summarize this, would be map all the applications remote workers access first. I would replace VPNs now with ZTNA type services. And then I literally would eventually sunset some VPN within, say, a 3-month period and just use ZTNA. That's an architecture. It's not a product out there. A lot of people say, oh, well, what product is that? Well, it's your architecture. DLP, right? Um, people remote could have access to things with like PII information, right? So they need to work with that. And then think about all the shadow IT stuff, personal
Mhm.
Dropbox, people storing stuff to personal Dropbox or using AI and Chat GPT and all these different things or whatever on the personal laptop, putting company information out into those open public things, and they're learning from all that data. That so have a policy about using AI too with remote workers, and don't let your kids be using elf bowling on your work laptop.
Yeah, no, 100% not. Let's try to keep that under control. So I'm gonna call it like one final question for you, and I'm
All right.
hearing this is an interesting one. So, and I'd love to hear your take on this. So, a lot of companies now are using ChatGPT, Gemini, Agent, the slew of stuff, and everybody's under the assumption of privacy, compliance, control, let's call it the paid version of ChatGPT. But even the ones that are not, there's so many companies that we've gone into in the past few months that employees are able to basically open up personal accounts and upload IP. I call it company IP, like customer lists, price sheets for them to do their own personal work to help them be more productive in the workplace. How do you help reduce that risk? Like, what's out there for companies to kind of mitigate their risk, or what policies should we be enabling to help companies control the misuse of AI? And this is a big one.
Yeah. So to me, first off, your governance and executives like basically coming up with a policy first and foremost. Then there should be training on that to show them the reasons why this is dangerous for the company as a whole, right? So kind of get that understanding first. You can bring into teams, right? Behind the firewall, chat GPT, if you will, for like, or open AI within your own company firewalls, right? So inside the domain as opposed to going way out there. Right.
Yeah.
So there is the ability to do that out there. And that's the first and foremost. I mean, even like recently, with the military, when you log in, you'll see that there's this thing that you can use, Chat GPT right there. Well, do you really think that they're going to allow people to that's behind the firewall. That's behind our lines. They and if you can't export the stuff, right? So um, if it's you're I would say that the high risk is like, okay, obviously public chat GPT, right? Never use it for work content because these prompts, they're using that for their model training, and you're starting to put financial information of the company. Hey, here's a list of my customers. Which ones would probably not be a customer of ours in a year so I don't have to focus on them? Well, hi, you just put company information out there. But I guess I would call it data isolation, right? Um, there's enterprise chat GPT type stuff, right? It's general research, non-sensitive type stuff. But if you think about it, private endpoints, data zones, Azure OpenAI type thing, right? You want to have that maximum control, right? You want to make sure the data never leaves your Azure tenant. And you can even have regional data residency with that too, right? So, and I think that would also help with Law 25 as an example. Mm, I know that there's data residency, like OpenAI does, started in 2026, I don't remember, but OpenAI now allows for like data residency for enterprise customers, like in certain regions. For the US, I know Europe's another, but only when they're using ChatGPT Enterprise, right?
Yeah.
So, but I would say the non-negotiable controls for them, data classification policies. I would color things like, hey, if it's public info, general prompts, right? Hey, write me a Python loop or something, right? Okay, fine. Internal docs without internal intellectual property, like meeting notes or whatever, or charts. Okay, I would use that like more of an Azure OpenAI thing. But if it's like source code, customer PII, financials, right? Sorry, don't, nope, don't pass go. I got to keep that behind the firewalls. But you got to have a policy first and tell people this is our policy because because you can't hold people responsible for something if you didn't decide to say this is what we're doing,
Yeah.
right? So does it make sense?
Oh, it makes sense completely. And we've been preaching it that, for most businesses out there, if you're using Google, use Gemini. If you're using Microsoft, use Copilot.
Yeah, we're talking
Yeah.
about shadow AI basically, right?
Yeah.
Out there. Right. So you got to have that acceptable use policy, right? It's got to be defined, right? And then network level blocking, I guess. Put some firewalls in there, you know.
Yeah.
Can't use chat.openai.com or whatever unless it's approved as an enterprise account or something. But again, a governance checklist, I think is important.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely a big concern to a lot of businesses out there. We've seen it time and time again where companies don't realize the amount of employees, call it assumption of doing the right thing, but not realizing the repercussions of it. So, um,
I would even,
it's,
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, data loss prevention is another one,
yeah,
right? And if you're classifying, you're documented your data classification, but DLP would be another. I was just randomly just came to me.
oh, yeah, no, for sure. So, to wrap this podcast up, I always love to do this to my guests, sort of a words of wisdom, what should, people out there listening to this episode today, how do you want to wrap this up for everybody out there, you want to give everybody like sort of what they should be doing, words of wisdom, want to wrap it up maybe on what Acronis can offer. Obviously, this is you're coming in for with under the Acronis badge. Where do you want to wrap this conversation up? I leave it to you.
Yes, I would guess I would start first by from an Acronis perspective. Yeah, we got a whole bunch of stuff, right? But it's all with one agent, which makes things very operationally efficient for people, right? We're all about protecting, managing, and automation. That is our focus moving forward. We're actually employing a lot of AI into our product to actually make things easier for them, and it's an architectural and a philosophical shift for us, right? We're not just bundling backup and security under one license, but we're engineering them together to share some context and orchestrate recovery when threats actually succeed, right? So the question comes down to is prevention is going to fail. So the threat landscape today would demand resilience, not just stopping the attacks, but making sure that business continuity will happen when it succeeds, right? So cyber protect, like we used to say, means engineering systems and security events to automatically trigger valid recovery options, right? And have auditable proof of data integrity, immutable backups, even when an attacker gains some admin privileges, right? So cybersecurity says, hey, did we stop the attack? But for us, with the whole philosophy now of protect, manage, and automate, we're saying, can it be proven we recovered clean data with our maximum tolerable downtime? So that's a shift from prevention centric to resilience centric architecture, right? To again, protect, manage, and automate what actually is delivered in cyber protection out there. So that's from an Acronis perspective. With that being said, in general, just know that these threat actors, they're capitalists and they're going to change their methods, whatever is going to be most advantageous. And the more that we as vendors start to throw more AI at this and start doing more protect, manage, and automate, they will start using the same stuff to actually try to counter that. So it's always going to be a cat and mouse game. So you need to stay on top of things and look at your insurance, regulatory compliance stuff first, look at your business impact analysis, classify your data, and prioritize with everything. That's my
Amazing.
son.
Yeah, no, amazing. Very concise keywords. I think those were a specific list to action against. So I want to thank you, Steve, for coming out on our show this week. Again, thank you, Acronis, for being a longstanding partner of ours. Always a trusted source. We originally started working with you guys like 10 years ago with backup and disaster recovery, and we've obviously evolved our relationship as well. Always a concrete vendor to work with, very reliable and very resilient. So thank you again for your time, Steve. Looking forward for an amazing year ahead of us, and hopefully we'll get you guys back at another episode later on in the year.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
If you liked what you, if you, everybody, if you like what you heard today, please follow and like and subscribe. Talk to you soon.